Welcome, everybody. It's been a full and productive day. So much great information has been shared, and there's been such thoughtful, constructive discussion. I know a lot of you have been enjoying the work of Zara Zainal, the graphic illustrator. Well, a tab has now been embedded in the left-hand column of the virtual lobby, so you're able to go there and check out all of her work under the Live Illustrations tab. And I hope you've been sharing what you've been learning and your thoughts, not just with each other, but on social media as well. We're using the hashtags of hashtag affordable housing, hashtag housing assembly 2021, and hashtag social value of housing. To round out the evening, we have a very special keynote session indeed. Now, this session will be recorded just as many of today's and yesterday's discussions have been taped, and we will make those available on demand in the coming hours. You can also go back to the virtual lobby and click back into a session to re-watch it. Well, here we go. Our next session is a keynote presentation on a New Deal legacy, race and fair housing in America. And to introduce and facilitate this session, I'd like to welcome Paul Walker, Professor of Architecture and Director from the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Karen. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Melbourne stands on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge that those of us in Australia will be on the lands of many Aboriginal nations, given how we are meeting tonight, and to welcome all Indigenous people who are present. Our keynote speaker tonight is Professor Barbara Penner, Professor of Architectural Humanities at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. The work Barbara will be presenting tonight is part of her ongoing inquiry into the work of the now neglected American public housing advocate, Catherine Bauer. Bauer was a strong voice for public housing in the United States between the 1930s and the 1960s. In 2020, Barbara produced a new edition of Bauer's book, Modern Housing, published first in 1934. And Barbara did that with a new introductory essay, Housing is More Than Houses, which is very much in keeping with this symposium, I think. Barbara has also written a widely read essay on Bauer in the online American journal Places in 2018. Called The Still Dreary Deadlock of Public Housing, prefacing the republication of a Bauer essay from 1957. Tonight, Barbara will introduce new research that she's recently undertaken on Bauer at the University of California, Berkeley in the last few weeks. So please ask questions in the question function. After Barbara's talk, we will get to the questions. We're joined tonight by Catherine Townsend and Philip Goad to respond to Barbara and perhaps to give a local Melbourne response to some of the issues that may come up in the talk tonight. I'm sure that Philip needs no introduction, but for those of you who do not know him, he is Chair of Architecture and Distinguished Redmond Barry Professor at the University of Melbourne. And Catherine Townsend is a doctoral candidate in the Melbourne School of Design. Philip, Catherine and I have recently been writing essays on architecture and housing issues in Melbourne during the 1960s and 1970s. So that's why I asked them to come along tonight to be part of the response to Barbara's paper. But first, let's welcome Barbara Penner speaking on a New Deal legacy, race and fair housing in America. Thank you, Barbara.
So good morning or good evening. First off, I would just like to very sincerely thank the organizers of this event and Paul Walker specifically for the invitation. It's always lovely when you're asked to speak to a topic that's near and dear to your heart, and affordable housing is very close to mine. So thank you. This morning or tonight, I intend to focus on a particular episode in American housing history, the campaign for fair housing between the mid-1940s and 1968. This is the year that President Lyndon Johnson passed the Fair Housing Act, one of the final, and it has to be said, one of the most contentious pieces of his Great Society platform. While this history is particular to America, it has obvious resonances with Australian history, and we'll hope to address some of these resonances later in the panel. Next slide, please. My specific entree into these discussions is the American houser, Catherine Bauer. Next slide. Some of you may know her from her classic book, Modern Housing, which was published in 1934, and as Paul said, has recently been reissued. And Modern Housing was a brilliant polemic about how America's housing shortage could only be solved through a European-style housing program. What may be less well known is that even before this book was published, Bauer had leapt into union activism as a way of bringing about these changes. She was one of the driving forces behind the Housing Act of 1937. This was America's first permanent national housing act, and it was a key element of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. In fact, Bauer helped draft this act. She was one of its co-authors. But she was incredibly clear-eyed about its deficiencies, and she would campaign tirelessly for amendments to it for the next 3 decades until her death in 1964. Notably, she would emerge as a vocal and ardent supporter of fair housing in the post-war period. I'm personally very interested in this strand of Bauer's work because housing discrimination has again moved front and center of political debate in America. Housing discrimination, next slide please, underlies recent calls for reparations to Black Americans, for instance, made by Ta-Nehisi Coates. In this very influential piece published in The Atlantic in 2014, Coates argued that discrimination disproportionately affects the employment and educational opportunities of minoritized groups, and that the effects of these disadvantages gets compounded over time. In his argument, reparations are the only way to reverse the wealth gap that has been produced over time. And you'll see in the cover here, there's reference to the compounding debts of our ancestors. Wherever one stands on the specific question of reparations, there is broad consensus today that housing discrimination persists. What is perhaps more surprising is that its cause is highly disputed, and these disputes have cast a shadow over the legacy of the New Deal and of New Dealers like Bauer. Next slide, please. On the one hand, the New Deal continues to be reverently invoked in progressive legislation like the Green New Deal for public housing, launched in April this year, or in Joe Biden's infrastructure bill. Next slide, please. On the other hand, its legacy is also being strongly challenged, not only by those on the right, as you would expect, but also by those on the left, with housing again emerging at the center of these debates. I have in mind the recent and quite acrimonious dispute between two heavyweight scholars from Berkeley, both Richard Rothstein and Richard Walker. Rothstein, in his widely read The Color of Law, argues that racist New Deal housing policies created segregation where none had existed previously, whereas Walker, who is a founder of the organization Living New Deal, believes Rothstein's reading is simply wrong, and in publicly shaming the New Deal, plays right into the hands of conservatives who see government as the problem, not the solution. So I can't hope to settle these arguments today, but I would at least try to explain how we've got here. How is it that a progressive New Deal Housing Act, which saw the federal government accept for the first time that it had a permanent obligation to house citizens decently, how is it that this act now stands accused of racism? I think to understand this charge, we first need to recognize the very particular form that federal housing programs took in America. From the beginning, their aim was always to assist, not assume, the housing burden. The result was a highly devolved system, which was officially preferred on the grounds that housing was an issue that was best dealt with locally. It was an intimately local problem. But unofficially, of course, it reflected the federal government's reluctance to be seen to be competing with private builders, thus upsetting the real estate lobby, which then, as now, is very powerful. For these reasons, from the 1930s, the federal government adopted a decentralized, two-pronged approach to housing. Next slide, please. First, it set up the United States Housing Authority, the USHA, which channeled low-cost loans and subsidies to local authorities to fund their own low-rent public housing and renewal programs. So this part of the program was aimed at low-income tenants. Second, and far more influentially, it set up the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, which channeled money to would-be homeowners through mortgages and mortgage insurance programs. By guaranteeing mortgages for homeowners, these bodies effectively stabilized the private housing market, mediating risks for builders and spurring on suburban growth. And this is really key to understand. America has long used public monies to guarantee private development in housing. So it's a system of publicly guaranteed private housing that benefits the middle class. While this two-pronged or two-tiered system had its logic, it also had its weaknesses. There are obvious problems with relying on local knowledge to guide new housing construction, especially in a country still under Jim Crow. Ironically, the government's own real property surveys from the 1930s, next slide please, revealed very clearly that minoritized groups most frequently occupied substandard housing. So this was the conclusion of the San Francisco Real Property Survey of the early 1940s vis-a-vis Chinatown. Local housing authorities did build low-rent housing for these groups, but this housing was usually segregated. In the South, next slide please, segregation was done very openly. So you see here the USHA-funded Halifax Court, built and operated for low-income white families. And on the right, the Robert Mills Manor, open for white tenants. Next slide, please. Less frequently mentioned is the fact that northern states also built segregated housing. And so you see an instance here, Willett Park in Buffalo, New York, slum clearance project for rehousing Negroes. Admittedly, some attempts were made to integrate northern projects, but these were stymied by the fact that financing for these projects was always tied to slum clearance. And this was something that Bauer really abhorred. She thought it was a terrible mistake. For each new unit built, one unit had to be cleared. And this meant that new projects often ended up rehousing those who hadn't been able to find other housing in the interim. So this meant that those with the fewest housing options ended up in housing projects. And this further, of course, entrenched existing social patterns. However egregious the USHA's projects were, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, was an even more blatant offender in terms of discrimination. Even though it was a government agency, the FHA operated as a private one. So it operated more like a bank in seeking to conserve the value of its investments. To this end, next slide, please. It decided from the start, and with no real evidence, that socially homogeneous, harmonious housing developments were the safest investments, and it refused to lend to integrated developments. To ensure this homogeneity, the FHA encouraged developers to insert race-restrictive covenants like this one into deeds. And it's incredibly naked, that the said land or buildings thereon shall never be rented, leased, etc., by any Negro or colored person or person of Negro blood. Next slide, please. The FHA also engaged in redlining using security maps like this one. The FHA refused to guarantee mortgages in red areas, which were mixed, with the predictable result that the agency rarely guaranteed mortgages for non-whites. These actions together ensured that the housing shortage for minoritized groups became ever more acute. They had fewer housing options, so they tended to double up, paying a far greater proportion of income for overcrowded houses in poorly connected areas far from jobs and schools. The case for reparations rests on this historic lack of access to opportunities, as well as the inability to accumulate wealth from home ownership. It's also what challenges to the New Deal are based on. Rothstein argues that New Deal agencies purposefully perpetuated racism in open violation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He asks, why did the USHA not simply refuse to fund segregated projects? Why was the FHA not forced to ban race-restrictive covenants, especially after the Supreme Court in 1948 declared them to be unenforceable? So not unconstitutional, but legally unenforceable. Yet these practices persisted in both public and private housing until 1968, and often well beyond that. To such difficult and legitimate questions, defenders of the New Deal, like Walker, say, yes, there was certainly racism. The US was and is a racist country, but New Dealers did not invent racism, and given what was at stake, affordable housing, were they wrong to push for radical new legislation, even if imperfect? There is no doubt that New Dealers were very aware of flaws in the Housing Act of 1937 and also subsequent acts. Bauer and her fellow housers were ambivalent about the act from the start, as deep compromises had to be made to placate the real estate lobby and get it passed. But Bauer still viewed the act overall as a victory. She described it as a triumph of left over right, and saw it as a starting point, the thin end of the wedge. Bauer believed it was her job to help build what she called love for public housing amongst citizens in order to give housers the leverage that they needed to strengthen future acts. Next slide, please. And this desire to create action amongst citizens would lead to her only other book, the short but rousing A Citizen's Guide to Public Housing of 1940. And if you can get a hold of this book, I'd still highly recommend it. It's very inspiring. Moreover, as the effects of discriminatory practices became apparent, New Dealers like Bauer became the most vocal lobbyists for fair housing. Other important figures here were Bauer's allies, Charles Abrams and Robert C. Weaver. Next slide, please. Weaver had been a member of Franklin D. Roosevelt's so-called Black Cabinet in the 30s, and he would come to head up Johnson's new Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, from 1966. And he was the first Black cabinet minister in America. Throughout the 1940s, Weaver wrote a series of damning articles about the effects of race-restrictive covenants, culminating in his landmark, but now shamefully out-of-print book, The Negro Ghetto, making the point that housing is the one commodity in the American market that is not freely available on equal terms to everyone who can afford to pay. He had the Black middle classes in mind here. Weaver consistently argued that the blockages in the housing market, such as racial covenants, had to be removed to prevent artificial shortages in housing. And opening up the suburbs to Black middle class people was absolutely key to integration in Weaver's mind. The cause of fair housing would gain momentum throughout the 1950s, so that by the 60s, the movement consisted of a broad coalition of over 1,000 faith groups, labor unions, housing and civic organizations, including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Council on Discrimination in Housing, the American Jewish Congress, the Council for Industrial Organization, and the Women's League of Voters. And this was a group that Eleanor Roosevelt was affiliated with. The cause of fair housing was argued on moral, social, economic, and legal grounds in what would be a series of very bitter local fights. Next slide, please. It always seemed to be a case of one step forward, two steps back, as fair housing came to be seen as one of the most contested and explosive issues of the 1960s. Some of the most consequential and painful of these battles happened in the early 1960s in California and involved Bauer, who was now living and teaching at Berkeley. In 1963, Berkeley itself became the site of one struggle. Next slide, please. Berkeley City Council passed a historic anti-segregation law that actually came with teeth, with real enforcement powers. But later that same year, it was repealed by voters in a referendum after a relentless scare campaign by the real estate lobby. Next slide, please. Undeterred, Berkeley Assemblyman William Byron Rumford then introduced a Fair Housing Act at state level in June 1963, the Rumford Act, which passed only to be nullified in its turn via the notorious Proposition 14. And the Prop 14 campaign was also funded by the real estate lobby, and its success was seen as a major blow where property rights trumped civil rights. Next slide, please. In the seesaw context of California, however, developers were not always the villains of the piece. We should mention Joseph and Ned Eichler, the state's most successful merchant builders. So, for instance, in 1964, they sold 80% of homes in Palo Alto. The Eichlers used their power and their success as builders to quietly fight for fair housing. Without telling the FHA, they sold houses on an open occupancy basis, progressively integrating their developments with the express aim of demonstrating that integrated housing could be both workable and profitable, as Weaver and others had long argued. Yet in architecture, when we talk about the Eichlers, we still tend to praise or even fetishize their modernist aesthetics, and we say very little about their politics. So with apologies, I'm now going to accelerate slightly up to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. As many of you will be aware, the years preceding its passage were amongst the most tumultuous in American history, and that's saying something. After his landslide election victory in 1964, Johnson succeeded in passing an unprecedented amount of progressive legislation, including Medicare and the Voting Rights Act. But in the summer of 1965, race riots kicked off in earnest in many American cities, hardening opposition to civil rights, as well as convincing many civil rights groups to abandon integration as a goal and turn to nationalist ideologies. Johnson himself was drawn ever more disastrously into Vietnam, so that by 1968, few thought he had the political capital needed to pass something as divisive as a fair housing bill. Tragically, what changed the mood was Martin Luther King's assassination, and just a week after King's murder, the Fair Housing Act was passed, prohibiting discrimination in public and private housing, and thus making good on the promise or remedying the flaws of the New Deal, depending on your views. The bill, however, was criticized for its weak powers of enforcement, and indeed, it would prove to be vulnerable during conservative presidencies, such as those of Reagan and Trump. So, apologies for accelerating at the end and leaving this history rather unresolved, but it's an impossible subject to sew up neatly, given that it's live and playing out today, even as we speak. But I hope you agree that it's clarifying to revisit this history, because it reminds us of some of the basic questions we need to engage when dealing with affordable housing. The New Deal government decided it had a duty to intervene in the housing market on behalf of citizens. Was it right to do so? If we believe that government must take a role, what forms should its interventions take, especially if we have social justice as an end goal? And as historians, if like me, you're a historian, how do we narrate stories of architecture, housing, progressivism, and race going forward so that housing discrimination is not again forgotten, as Rothstein charges? Finally, if I may, I'd like to end where I began, with Bauer specifically. As Paul mentioned, I've been working on Bauer now for about 4 years, and I've come to see that there was really an uncomfortable tension in her position, which she was never really able to resolve. Bauer always believed that in a capitalist society, government intervention was essential to providing decent low-rent housing. But she also believed that these government policies would always be flawed, and she placed her faith instead on groups of citizens coming together to fight to improve them. So she placed her faith in organized consumer demand. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. The problem was, as Bauer herself began to rather bitterly acknowledge later in life, that Americans never did grow to love housing. And she blamed this situation partially on architects. She actually had real sympathy for architects, but she felt that they'd never fully embraced the challenge of creatively and experimentally tackling housing as a social form. So I thought it was appropriate, or it would be appropriate, to leave my discussion here with the question, what can architects do to nurture love for fair, affordable housing today? So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Barbara. That was very, very provocative, very, and I think, and we can see how the New Deal idea is coming back in the United States. So one hopes that these issues to do with housing in the New Deal will also come back into public prominence. So what I'd like to do maybe is to get Philip and Catherine maybe to respond to try and get the conversation maybe bearing on the situation we face in Australia, where the federal government also was undertaking to guarantee mortgages in the 1940s, I believe. And where I don't think there would have been any quite so overt racism, but where nevertheless Indigenous Australians are terribly disadvantaged in the housing system still. So, Philip.
Yes, thanks, Paul, and thanks so much, Barbara. A wonderful presentation, thank you. And look, my response is to talk about the Australian situation, which is similar but different, of course. What's remarkable, I think, is the echo with the Housing Act of 1937 in the US, with the formation in 1938 of the Housing Commission of Victoria, a state-based authority as opposed to the Commonwealth. And that commission came about really through the deprivations of the Great Depression, 1929 to 32, and from the Depression, there were meetings of religious charities and social reformers, and public campaigns for housing reform led prominently here in Melbourne by a Methodist layman, Oswald Barnett, and supported, oddly enough, by the newspaper, the Herald newspaper, one of the Murdoch press, actually, lobbying government to establish the Housing Commission of Victoria, and so in 1938, which they did. And what was, I think, remarkable about the Housing Commission of Victoria from its outset was that it was promoting suburban villa estates through the 1940s in Melbourne, the capital city of Victoria, but also in regional Victoria. It was sort of a decentralisation program as well. But after the war, one of the key motivations for the formation of the Housing Commission of Victoria was a focus on the slums. And so slum clearance became a much stronger form of campaign, and many of the new villa estates in the post-war years were planned around the revitalisation of Victoria's manufacturing industry and also migration. So there was a sort of not so subtle form of housing for the deserving poor, and also the need to attract a labour force. And so migration was absolutely critical. But by the late 50s, slum clearance also became equated with the development of high-rise housing estates. And what one saw was a much more marked architectural and social segregation. So it was really a segregation based on class. And I think in the article that Catherine Bauer wrote in 57, she makes this great statement where she says, each project proclaims visually that it serves the lowest income group. So architecturally, you're sort of signalling, right, this is a particular grouping. And in Victoria, it was essentially class-based segregation. However, by the late 60s, that class-based segregation had given way to, I think, architecturally, a segregation based on ethnicity. And because those high-rise housing estates became largely the domain of waves of migrants, first Turkish and Lebanese, then Vietnamese, and now more recently Sudanese communities associated with specific estates. And so there's this sort of subtle segregation, but without necessarily the legalised points that you make, which were absolutely remarkable to see it in words, this idea of colour and race and, if you like, legislating segregation. There was never, I think, any of that direct sort of written policy. But nevertheless, there was, I think, as Bauer acknowledged by the late 50s in that fantastic article, that there were flaws in the policy, even though the altruism was, spot on, I think. The idealism was there. Catherine, did you want to mention or add to that?
Yeah, I might disagree somewhat, though.
Yeah, do.
I'm really interested in the idea of fair housing and open occupancy and how that plays out. Is my sound coming through properly? Yep. I'm really interested in how that plays out in Australia, because really we haven't, and when I say we, I mean we Australians haven't done the research to really be able to speak to how mortgages were handed out here, either those that were assisted by our governments or those outside that. But we had, institutional dynamics that actually racialized our housing. So unlike America, we had the White Australia policy. So we actually only let white people into the country. So there wasn't that pressing racialized need to segregate, because we actually weren't letting non-white people into the country. The other thing that I looked into when I was thinking about this today and yesterday was to actually find out when Indigenous Australians were actually given the right to purchase property in Australia. And I have to my absolute shame, I did not know this.
It's late.
First Nations people in Australia could not own property until 1967. So clearly we were, stopping, our First Nations people from purchasing property here in Australia. And the other thing that was actually happening in Australia, and I don't know whether this happened in America, was that women couldn't actually take out a loan without a male guarantor until 1971. So women were essentially barred from borrowing to purchase property until the early 70s. And I was wondering, in America, how does it play out with women being able to purchase property, and how did it play out with First Nations people in the States?
Thank you for those comments, and also for the parallels that you're making with Australia. And I am aware, I've tried to use the term minoritized groups, because this is, when we talk about race in America, it does immediately invoke Black Americans, but also, as you saw with the San Francisco property map, there are substantial populations of Asian Americans as well, and also Indigenous Americans. I personally know less about those histories, especially the Indigenous Americans, because Indigenous Americans were confined to reservations. And those were, again, these sort of very particular conditions, laws and rules applied to those. I should say I'm Canadian, and of course many of these conditions also exist in Canada. So those are very particular histories. I'd almost need to, I think, devote a special talk to those, but it's really important to invoke the fact that minoritized groups, we don't want to lump them all together. They all have these very particular and distinct histories that we should acknowledge. In terms of what the status of women, it's a great question, actually, whether or not women were allowed to apply for federally guaranteed, federally backed mortgages. I don't know. But one thing I would say, and this was something that Bauer was incredibly critical of, is the FHA certainly favored single family homes and the construction of single family homes, thus creating these incredibly homogenous suburban communities. And they did explicitly try to reinforce nuclear families and patriarchal family formations. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if there had been similar restrictions about who could take out these loans, and probably women would have been disadvantaged as well. It's a great point, though.
Barbara, can I ask about back to Catherine Bauer and the Housing Act? And I was wondering how much the social and economic hardships of the Great Depression in the States allowed for a political easing of reliance on private real estate and development interests, and thus in a way enabled an easing in of the acceptance of the Housing Act and Bauer's work. So she was there at the right moment for that. and how much the Depression in the States was like it was in Australia, a contributor?
Oh, it was completely essential. It was a great crisis, but Bauer saw it as a great opportunity. She really believed it was this once-in-a-lifetime chance to weaken the stranglehold of capitalists over the housing market. And so the Great Depression enabled, and the crisis of the Great Depression enabled political discussions that would have been completely impossible even in the late 1920s. It changed things so dramatically. And as ever, it really does take crisis to sort of somehow make certain conversations possible. So it was absolutely key.
Yeah.
Bauer herself was in the 1930s was a great admirer not only of Europe but also of the USSR. And that would get her into quite a bit of trouble in the post-war period. She was investigated by the House for Un-American Activities in part because of this dalliance. But suddenly socialism during the Great Depression was not as inconceivable as it had been just a few years before.
Sure. Interesting the comment that Catherine made about Indigenous Australians. Yes, they weren't allowed to own property until after 1967. If you were in New South Wales, you were, or in South Australia, you were allowed to own property. But as early as, well, in 1959, the Housing Commission in Victoria was building houses for Aboriginal communities. And so that's an area which is relatively unexplored in scholarship here. But listening to you tonight, I think it's an area that deserves more detailed study around policy reasons for that, those buildings, particularly in a period of what was called assimilation here in Victoria, in Australia generally, with Indigenous people. The other aspect I wanted to ask about Catherine Bauer and her husband, and whether he shared the same political, if you like, ideals about fair housing, and were they a formidable team in thinking about fair housing generally?
It's a good question. So Bauer, for those of you who may not know, Bauer was married to William Worcester, who was one of the leading so-called Bay Region architects, and he was very well known for his residential architecture, individual houses, and housing developments, low-cost housing developments. Of course, they were an incredible power couple. Worcester was dean first of MIT, and then he became dean at Berkeley. And he had a tremendous influence on the architectural scene in America. They did always try to keep their professional careers separate, that was a conscious decision on their part. But of course, they influenced each other. Bauer gave Worcester, I think, a much keener sense of the political stakes in his housing developments, made him more interested in concepts of neighborhood planning, community planning, And I think Worcester, in his turn, gave Bauer a great sympathy and a great awareness of architects, and she was always a great champion of architects and believed they had a great deal of power. She was, unlike most other housers, she felt aesthetics were important, and she wanted to see architects designing not just homes, but communities. And so she, in a way, she wanted to give them greater power than they were typically given. And I think in a way that sympathy for architecture and that respect for the power of architects really came from her marriage with Worcester.
Thank you.
Can I ask Barbara about Bauer's views of slum clearance? My understanding from your work is that she was, well, not just diffident, but actually opposed to slum clearance, and that she felt that the way to build public housing for poor or discriminated Americans was to build new communities, and this was based primarily, I suppose, on the idea that communities that looked like slums from the outside had mostly a certain kind of social cohesion that would be destroyed in the build one, demolish one kind of approach of American housing policies. Can you comment on her view of slum clearance and what sort of housing, what sort of housing should be built for discriminated communities or impoverished communities?
So Bauer absolutely felt that federal housing policies, especially towards the end of her life, she felt that they had failed for two reasons. First of all, she felt they paid too much attention and they were too dominated by the goal of slum clearance, later urban renewal. So you're absolutely right. But she also just felt that the two-tiered system of sort of low rent housing for poor people and then home ownership for the middle classes had sort of completely condemned the system because it was so obviously unequal. So she felt inequality had really been baked into the system in a way that meant that it would never gain popular support, at least among the working classes who it was meant to benefit. So she really saw those two problems. The problem with urban renewal or slum clearance, then urban renewal, was that she felt that the cost of land was such that you could never build good quality housing on these sites. The financial model somehow never worked. And so she really preferred building new developments, new communities, ideally on what we would now call greenfield sites outside of expensive city centers. And she also just saw that there was an unsurmountable problem in terms of displacing people and rehousing people who had been displaced by slum clearance and urban renewal. And so she felt that that was another real problem that somehow the federal government had never adequately grasped or dealt with, was the displacement problem. And so she said, well, you know, I'll consider urban renewal, but only if you can guarantee me that every single person who is displaced is offered good quality rental accommodation in the interim while this new housing is being built. In terms of her ideal, she remained a committed neighborhood planner. She didn't use that term towards the end of her life, but the lesson of Ernst May and New Frankfurt remained with her throughout her career. And she really believed that you needed to plan socially diverse communities that catered to all races, all classes, and all generations as well. She became quite interested in housing for the elderly, as it was then called, as well. She wanted to see very mixed new communities being built from the ground up, with communal facilities, schools, shopping, leisure facilities, parks, and so on. So that was always her ideal.
And Catherine, I think that there are very strong parallels with the emerging opposition to the Housing Commission of Victoria's approach to slum clearance in Melbourne, that these objections that started appearing in the 1960s. I think they were very much on the same basis of Bauer's concern about slum clearance in the US. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, yes, the echoes are, absolutely there. And that was very much the criticism of the Housing Commission's activities in Melbourne in the 50s and 60s, because despite every effort, despite their limited attempts, they were never successful at actually rehousing communities. They never actually managed to rehouse people in the same suburb. And that enraged communities. But I'm wondering, as you talk about this, what was Bauer's perception of Jane Jacobs? Because they're operating at a very similar time and in very similar fields, but I suspect there's a divergence of opinion. Can you speak to that?
Of course, it's a bit of a bugbear of mine that, I think that Jacobs really still gets held up today as this kind of patron saint of cities. And Jacobs really attacked Bauer and also Lewis Mumford as what she called decentrist. And she sort of positioned them as being fundamentally anti-urban, pro-suburban, and really sort of mischaracterized, I think, a lot of what they believed and what they were trying to do. There were, ironically, I think, a lot of parallels between Bauer and Jacobs. They both promoted socially mixed communities. They were advocates of grassroots activism. They really believed that you needed an active citizenry to have a sort of vital housing or urban scene. But they did diverge on this point of sort of the role of cities. And Bauer wasn't anti-city. It's just that she never believed that you could achieve low rent housing in cities. As I said, she did prefer sort of building new communities outside of cities, which was completely unacceptable to Jacobs. But you know, and for Jacobs, I think the other real black mark against Bauer was that Bauer remained an advocate of planned communities to the end of her life. And Jacobs really wanted to see a move away from top-down planning. So those were some of their points of divergence. But I do think Jacobs was quite unjust to Bauer as well. And I think Bauer was actually much more aware of and vocal about the effects of race on the dynamics of housing. And Jacobs actually was silent on those issues.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Completely silent on government's involvement in affordable housing and, as you say, fair housing. You talked about developing a love for fair housing. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
And can I just intervene and say that we have a comment, in fact, from Helene? I think I'm not sure which Helene, but anyway, saying I think it is striking that Barbara concludes with a call for nurturing love for fair and affordable housing. And there was a session this morning in the housing symposium about the necessity and politics of care in housing, particularly with speaker Emma Power. And Helene refers to Emma Power's important argument for conceptualizing housing as an infrastructure for care. It would be great to hear more about this love and how it can be mobilized, perhaps as a means of shifting our quote, screwed neoliberal market-driven value systems.
Yes. Well, it's, I think Bauer never completely cracked it. She knew that popular support was really key to garnering that political support that was needed to pass public housing acts and so on. I think one of the reasons why she was so disappointed with architects is that she believed they'd taken a wrong turn with their embrace of towers and high-rise housing. In particular, she felt that that was a terrible decision on the part of architects because she believed it was un-American, living in towers, but she also believed that it stigmatized people who lived in those projects. And because of that stigmatization, she believed that the people who lived there could never love their housing. So she again, believed that architects had the power, both through aesthetics and experimentation. They had the ability to turn around public perceptions of housing. And she believed that in order to build housing that was acceptable to people, they had to be far more attentive to users. They had to be far more sympathetic to users. She believed they needed to reject towers and turn more towards Scandinavian-inspired architecture, so more humane forms of architecture. So that was really key for her. She also placed a lot of importance on maintenance and management of housing. And she really believed that women should be trained to take on management roles within existing housing developments. And she believed that maintenance was also a really essential part to making housing succeed, and also in that sort of emotional investment that tenants would have in their housing. She believed that would sort of make them care and fight for their developments. And she felt that would also help maintain value long term. So it was complex for her. But there was definitely a strong element of what we now would call care or effective labor there.
I've got a clarification. That question was from Helene Frichot, not surprisingly.
Oh, hello, Helene. Hi.
Helene also makes the point that the phrase minoritized groups that you use speaks to the process of marginalization and avoids fixing identity but critiques and imposed conditions. So I do think, we appreciate very much how careful your language tonight, Barbara, has been. I think we are nearly at the end of our period, but there is another question from Karen, our MC. So can Barbara comment on the private sector's attitude to marginal communities? It strikes me that banks and corporates are also responsible for marginalisation. Having visited many US cities, the highest rates of foreclosures are usually in African-American neighbourhoods. And it did strike me, when you were talking, Barbara, what was in it for real estate companies to exclude the black market? I mean, surely just commercial decisions would lead them to cultivate another market for housing.
Yes, absolutely. And that is something that is a real puzzle. It's something that Robert Weaver was particularly preoccupied with. He was a Black middle-class man himself. And so he saw that there was this pent-up demand amongst the Black middle classes for suburban housing, and they were literally unable to buy. So he believed that the real estate market they'd become dependent on artificial housing shortages to drive demand, keep demand high, keep prices high for housing. He also believed that in order to change things, you really needed to make a financial argument. You needed to make this point that integration would not hurt business, and it could be done in such a way that profits could still be made. The criticism that gets made of Weaver, and I think it's a legitimate criticism, is that it ignores the extent to which white supremacism was an ideology. It wasn't, necessarily a rational thing, but the liberal democracy was entangled with white supremacy in the United States, and that just has to be acknowledged head on. And as historians, we have to be able to get our heads around this complexity that, you've the New Deal, which on the one hand saved liberal democracy, was also kind of in bed with white supremacists in the South. So I would say that, it has a rationale, but it's the rationale of white supremacy, not of the market.
Okay, well, I think that's a suitably somber point on which to end. I'd really like to thank you, Barbara, for what has been a fantastic talk, and I'd like to thank panelists Philip Goad and Catherine Townsend. Thanks, Catherine, for saving me from the blunder about structural racism existing in Australia and reminding me that was so. I think what Barbara has demonstrated to us tonight is a kind of history of responsibility, a history of care, indeed a history of love, and I think that in pointing to at the start of her talk to the question of reparations, which now arises in the United States through this history of very poor housing choices available for Black Americans. She reminds us that this history is not just in the past, but as a living legacy that will continue to have ramifications. And we should ask ourselves in Australia also what histories that we have repressed will come back to help shape our futures as well. So thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you for joining us at the beginning of your day in London. And so thank you very much. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was a really terrific presentation as well. The contributions from Paul, Philip and Catherine. A great day we have had and a great session to conclude the night. Informative, innovative and inspiring, I say. And an incredible discussion just now with Barbara Penner, channeling Catherine Bauer to discuss racism in public housing in the US. I was certainly really struck by her words that those early policies were aimed at assisting, not assuming, the housing burden, yet it seems to have failed to even assist the most marginal of Americans. The reparations debate that Paul has just raised again is one to watch. I think when you're looking at reparations for the lack of opportunities, the inability to accumulate wealth for African Americans, and when you see that there is still a huge problem in the wealth and inequality in the US. And it's telling that this is still a live issue in America, in part because of the Trump factor. But of course, Indigenous Australians have also been badly treated by government policies here, assimilation policies, dispossession, being legally non-persons until 1967. And I think the panel has identified a need to know a lot more about this. It was really very thought-provoking, and I thank Barbara in particular. So much of what was discussed today was really making you really think. Once again, it's the lived experience of Sinner in our first session this morning that has really stuck with me all day. She spoke of the thousands of rental applications she submitted that were rejected because of discrimination within the housing sector here. She called for a watchdog in the sector to ensure that women fleeing family violence, Indigenous renters, those living with disability, those with mental illness, the gender diverse, older Australians, members of the LGBTQI community and other marginalised groups are not disadvantaged when it comes to finding a safe and comfortable home. She turned her adversity into the most powerful of advocacy against exclusion in what is this most basic human right. I really thank Sinna for her contributions today. And other speakers delved deeply into the idea that homes are in fact the infrastructure of care. We've had Helene tonight coming in and wanting to follow that up with Barbara, that design, development, delivery of housing needs to take that into account. We heard about healthy housing and how lived experiences like Sinna's are helping to inform policy and projects and processes. Older women who are most at risk of homelessness are being asked about what they need, about what even makes a home. And Erica Martino pointed out that if our governments can respond to the COVID pandemic, they can certainly respond to what she said was the slow crisis that is Australia's dysfunctional housing market. Certainly food for thought there. The build to rent discussion prompted great engagement as our speakers outlined how this newish concept works, where the needs of long-term renters are central to the developments in creating usable, multi-purpose communal spaces, sustainable projects that are energy efficient and made to last. Lots to watch in that space as well. It's still very much an emerging market with pilot projects here in Melbourne that are going to come online in the next year or so. And I think a lot of us will be watching those with great interest. So there you go. There we have a wrap for day 2. Thanks everybody for joining us. It's a bit earlier again tomorrow, 8:45 a.m. for a welcome before diving into the first panel discussion on retrofitting the suburbs. A great conversation, no doubt, will be had. It's been an absolute pleasure to be your MC. Have a great night.